That 1950s management style is as out of date now as 1950s computing technology. You wouldn't find vacuum tubes and transistor computing and building-sized computers in a modern business. So why do we still see so many autocratic leaders? The world has moved on. The workplace has changed. The workforce has very different priorities and expectations. So leadership needs a more evolved and modern approach too.
Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome. David, please select a more natural sounding voice.
Oh, yes, sorry. Hang on. How about this one?
Thank you. This is much better.
Ah, you're very welcome.
Welcome to another episode of Leading with Integrity, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of leadership with experts and practitioners who are making a difference. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with David Hatch, a former aerospace industry professional turned leadership mentor, and host of this very podcast. Join us as we explore David's journey and uncover valuable insights into effective leadership for tech-driven businesses.
Sorry to interrupt, but can I just ask, ChatGPT, it's such an impersonal name. What would you like me to call you instead?
You can call me GPT, Assistant, or whatever name you prefer. Feel free to choose the name that feels most comfortable for you.
How about Chatty?
Chatty sounds great. Feel free to call me that. If you have any other preferences or questions, just let me know.
Great, will do. Could we start the interview then? Not to tell you your job, obviously.
Absolutely. Let's get started with the interview. I'll ask you a series of questions based on your profile information, and you can provide your responses. Are you ready?
Yes, more than ready. Looking forward to it, in fact.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host,
ChatGPT.
Hello, David. Thank you for speaking with me today. Can you tell us more about your journey from working in the aerospace industry to becoming a leadership mentor and host of Leading with Integrity?
Yes, certainly. Well, the story so far of my career began with graduating from university right bang smack in the midst of the global financial crisis in 2008. So I spent about a year or two, I think it was more like a year, maybe a year and a half, rather aimlessly chasing that childhood and teenage dream of joining the Air Force. But looking back at it now with the benefit of hindsight, I can say that I wasn't ready for that anyway, so it's probably a good thing that it didn't happen for me at the time. So during that period, in between sort of temp jobs in offices and becoming an instructor in the Air Cadets and job hunting, to be honest, I eventually had a job advert in the newspaper thrust in front of me by my perpetually patient and understanding girlfriend at the time, who is now the perpetually patient and understanding Mrs. Hatch. Sorry, Chatty, just to go off on a tangent, you probably don't know what a newspaper is, do you? Well, in the olden days before you were born and when the internet itself was still a bit of a staggering toddler, we still used this ancient technology called paper as our primary means of distributing information, knowledge, and even the latest news. So for many people who were on a job hunt back then, the classifieds section of the newspaper, it was called, was the first place to go to find job ads and contact info and how to apply and all of that sort of stuff. So anyway, getting back on topic, this particular job ad was for a job in an aerospace startup. It was quite vague about the company, but the job itself looked like a pretty good place to start a career in an industry that I had a fairly obvious personal interest in. So I sent in a CV. After a couple of interviews, was offered the job. It was a small company, which suited me. Having done a few of those temp jobs in big corporates, I'd more or less decided by that point those weren't the companies for me. And I enjoyed the small team environment and feeling that because there were so few of you, everything you did and everything you worked on had a visible impact on the business as a whole. And that was kind of cool. And I spent about a decade working there. We did all sorts of weird but interesting projects, ranging from aircraft modification and planning oil spill exercises on the south coast of England to buying and selling rivets and nuts and bolts to air forces around the world. And by far the most exciting project was what later became the next company that I worked for. Through a series of introductions, we'd found our way into the space industry. We set up a new startup, a new company in the satellite Earth observation sector. Space is cool, as they say, but it's also one of the most challenging sectors to operate a business in. And sadly, maybe not sadly, unfortunately perhaps, like any cool thing, any industry really, any job, if you do it long enough, the coolness kind of goes away. It just becomes a bit mundane, a bit routine, even boring some days. But being such a challenging sector to operate in is probably why there's another cliche that quite often gets trotted out. You see it in the news articles whenever anyone has a rocket blow up, which is space is hard. And when you have ambitious goals like we did, which involved buying and launching our own satellites, it's also immensely expensive, which is a long-winded way of saying that it created some pretty big challenges for the company and for the team. There were other difficulties in the background too that I can't really talk about openly. Sorry about that, Chatty. You'll have to read between the lines, I suppose. And at the same time, we were growing pretty quickly. In the first 2 or 3 years, when it was a project of the previous company, there were only 3 or 4 of us working on it at any given time. When we went official, in inverted commas, and went full time towards the end of 2015, we went from 4 to 10 people pretty quickly. And then within the span of 2 years or so after that, that had grown to 30 people, or 40-ish, if you count all of the part-time consultants and advisors that we were working with by then. And with all of that, unsurprisingly perhaps, comes growing pains. And in the context of the industry, the difficulty of what we were trying to do, the need to raise further investment and the technical challenges involved, plus all that behind the scenes stuff, and there's no two ways of saying it really, but some shortfalls in leadership and management approaches, let's say, it didn't take very long before all of that stuff, all of those issues combined, and we had a pretty big culture problem. There was a leadership problem, which meant the culture problem went unresolved, and things really just came to a head in 2019. Now, I can't really speak to the experiences of anyone else who was there at the time, but for me, by the beginning of that year, in my head, I knew it was time to go, it was time to leave, but my heart was still telling me things like, no, you've got to stick with it, David, that's no way to carry on a career. Things will come good in the end, you've just got to persevere. Wouldn't it be a shame to walk away after all these years and waste all that time and effort that you've put in so far to get this far? Another kind of the self-doubt creeps in as well. Like, what if you can't find another job? What if you never earn a decent salary again? What if? I know now, of course, again, with the benefit of hindsight, that I stayed too long. I should have walked away right then as soon as I realised. And I finally did leave in early November that year. So I stayed nearly a year once I'd realised it was time to go. And by then, I was burnt out, stressed out, angry, bitter, disillusioned with the company, with the industry, with the workplace as a whole, and just in entirely the wrong place in my head, in my mindset, to be going out and looking for a job. So lots of my earlier what ifs pretty much became self-fulfilling at that point. I went to a number of interviews. I'll always be grateful to those people. They know who they are, who gave me the opportunity to do so. They heard me out during that process. And it was a big help to me at the time, even though it didn't work out. But it was very helpful in terms of my optimism and my mindset and recognizing what I needed to work on myself. So even though I didn't get any of those jobs, it was still an extremely useful process, and it did help me. It repaired my confidence a lot. It helped me recognize the gaps or the problematic bits in my mindset that I needed to work on. And it was also a really useful exercise, kind of forced me to start thinking rationally about my future instead of that knee-jerk of, oh, I've left, I don't want to work for someone ever again, and so on and so on. Now, having said all of that, what I don't want to do is talk down the majority of my former colleagues, especially in that last company. There were many great experiences we had together. I'm proud of the projects and the work that we did. To this day, I'm still in awe of the intelligence, the skills, the expertise that I was fortunate enough to work with. And again, they know who they are, but especially in the team that I was leading. And I'm still in touch with many of those incredible people today, several of whom have become a sort of informal business owner network for each other. So we chat about our problems that we're facing in our businesses. We collaborate when we can. We do what we can to support each other's businesses. So while it overall ended badly, the positives that I took away from it and that I can look back on today were pretty huge as well. I made some great friends. I'm still in touch with those today. And we did some interesting and worthwhile work. And perhaps most importantly, there were lots and lots of lessons learned about all kinds of things, but especially leadership, management, how to run a business, what does work, and definitely what doesn't work, what to do, what not to do. So I decided after a few months of job searching-ish, to try putting my money where my mouth was, really, and try to have control of my own fate, to be my own boss for a while. I was definitely done working for other people. Even after all of that reflection, it was time to have a break from that for a while. So I started out a company of one. I wanted to work with and support other small businesses, however I could. And initially that meant project management and planning, and then strategy, and then leadership development was added later as well. And that was nearly 5 years ago now. I've not really looked back except to reflect on some of those lessons learned and think about what I can do with those lessons and how I can do things differently today. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, COVID, hit about 5 months after I formed my company of one. And after a year or so of that, during one of the many lockdowns, I think there were so many of them, weren't there? I've kind of forgotten which one. They all blurred together. But I decided that I needed something to keep my brain going and my inspiration for leadership alive. And that's how this podcast was born. It's how I came to add the leadership practice to the company as well. And almost 3 years and 100 episodes as of this very episode later on, and we're still going. It's still going. And I absolutely love doing it. Having that opportunity to meet other leaders, business owners, experts, speakers. I learned something new about leadership and about leading people from every conversation. And it's incredible. I'm very fortunate.
What inspired you to focus specifically on helping new and first-time managers?
Okay, this is a big one. You'll have to forgive me, Chatty, if I get on the soapbox too much. I'll do my best not to. I spoke just now, though, about the lessons learned from my own career and from those startup experiences that I had. And there were many such lessons that have stuck with me ever since. Above all, though, it was seeing the impact and the difference that a leader can make to the everyday lives of the people they interact with, for bad or for good. That power of leadership, the huge responsibility that it implies, and an ever-growing understanding of problems like the accidental manager and the widespread use of autocratic, dictatorial leadership methods, even today, that led me really to adding that leadership practice to my business a few years ago during one of those COVID lockdowns, and then ultimately also to starting the Leading with Integrity podcast. And there are a few reasons why I focus on first-time leaders and new managers. To start with, these people will be in the front line of leadership. They are the ones who interact with the most people in a given organization on a given day. Their job is leading and getting the best from that grassroots employee level of a business. They are responsible for the people who make your business work and keep the doors open, the customer happy. They're turning the wrenches, they're making the widgets, they're delivering the service. These managers are usually the management representative from the customer's point of view as well. So in so many ways, they are the most important leaders in any company. And yet, the majority of management and certainly leadership development and training is not aimed at these first-line leaders, but at the more senior executives, the CEOs, the chiefy chiefs, and so on. There's an economic reason for that, of course, because those higher ups will attract bigger training budgets and they'll have more money of their own to spend on their own development. I'm certainly not saying that the strategic level leaders don't need access to leadership training either, because of course they do. But from a practical and operational perspective, key skills to lead teams of people doing the critical work of any organization need to be taught to those first timers, that first line of leadership. In fact, ideally, and this is a bit aspirational, a bit optimistic, idealistic, whatever word you like, but ideally that leadership development would be available to everyone across the organization, regardless of their position or their role, because in my firm belief, leadership is a universal skill set. It will make you better at any job you do. You don't have to be in a leadership position. That's probably getting ahead of ourselves, isn't it? So this is the second reason why I focus on those first-time leaders and those new managers. It's because they're too often overlooked when it comes to that kind of development and training, especially in smaller companies and startups where there is less likely to be an established internal training regime. Another reason, which is sort of related to that second one, is this. Every time I ask a room full of people the question, who here has had a bad experience with a manager, director, CEO, or founder, nearly everyone will raise their hand. But if I ask the opposite question, who's had a good or a great experience, far fewer hands go up. Partly that can be attributed to the way memory works and how those bad experiences are more likely to stand out in our recollections than the good ones. Similar to the way we're more likely to complain about bad service at a restaurant, for example, we are to compliment good service. But when we look at the data as well, we find from studies that are done by organizations like Gallup, the Institute of Leadership, the Chartered Management Institute, Udemy, Harvard Business Review, Forbes, there's others as well. There are some telling trends that come out of that. For example, globally, employee engagement sits at only about 21% of employees who say they are fully engaged with their job, with their work. It's higher in the US and lower in the UK. We only have about 17% here. And when answering follow-up questions about what has the most impact on that engagement at work, 70% of them mentioned their managers. And that was from the Gallup Global Workforce Survey a few years ago. If we look at staff retention figures, there's a Udemy study that found an average of 47% of employees say they've quit a job because of a bad manager or bad leader. And 60% of them think their managers need more training. And the CMI is putting out a lot of ads at the moment quoting this figure of 82% of managers who enter their role without having any leadership or management training. And that speaks directly to my next reason for wanting to help these new and first-time leaders. It's the accidental manager problem. I've mentioned it already. Long-time listeners will have heard me grumble about this one before as well, so I won't labour the point too much now. The accidental manager, if listener, you don't know what it means and you've not heard me complain about it before, is the person who is promoted to the job because they've excelled at their previous one. So let's say you're best engineer who produces the most reliable and highest quality machines in your company. They've been exceeding all of their targets for years, and the rest of the engineering team relies heavily on their advice and follows their example at work. So the boss logic is give that person a pay rise, make them a manager, give them that pat on the back. So the boss does that. And what happens next? You lose your best engineer and you gain an untrained and unqualified manager who probably hasn't got any leadership skills. Engineering and leadership are completely different skills, totally different mindset and way of thinking as well. Being great at one is no guarantee of being great or even mediocre at the other. And you could swap out engineer for salesperson or quality control or customer service representative, take your pick anywhere in the business, really. And I think the reason why this accidental manager thing really resonates with me so strongly is because it's basically me 12 years ago. I certainly wasn't an engineer, but I was promoted to my first management role. but given no training and no real support when it came to figuring out these crucial skills in leadership and in management that I needed in order to succeed as a manager. And also because it strikes me as so horribly unfair to everyone involved. If you think for a moment about those former colleagues of the engineer and now the new manager, they've lost that supportive comrade, that colleague that helped them with the difficult work that they could go to without any worries about recrimination or difficulty or anything like that. And they've gained an out-of-their-depth manager who's not really doing engineering anymore either. So their knowledge is going to be very quickly out of date. And then you think about that new manager themselves, the former engineer, who is now no longer allowed to do the work that they excel at and most likely loved doing as well, by the way, and who now has to figure out this new, stressful, and in many cases probably unwanted role. But because of the money side of things and the pay rise that was associated with that new job, they haven't felt able to turn it down. And they're likely worried that asking for help will put that pay rise at risk too. It's also pretty unfair to the whole organisation because you've lost a high performer and replaced it with a low one, effectively. And then the other two reasons why I really want to help these new leaders are that I want to spread modern, supportive, and integrity-driven approaches to great leadership to as many businesses as I can, as a way of countering the unfortunate popularity of what I would politely refer to as traditional leadership, by which I mean that autocratic, demanding, unsympathetic, rigid type of leadership that so many of us have in mind when we raise our hands to answer that question about bad leaders. That 1950s management style is as out of date now as 1950s computing technology. You wouldn't find vacuum tubes and transistor computing and building size computers in a modern business. So why do we still see so many autocratic leaders? The world has moved on. The workplace has changed. The workforce has very different priorities and expectations. So leadership needs a more evolved and modern approach too. And finally, and again, this is very much interwoven with the rest of my reasons, but the combined result of all of these issues tends to be a self-perpetuating cycle of bad, toxic, or simply ineffective leadership. New leaders aren't trained, so they do what we all tend to do in the absence of a better option. We emulate others. So we do what the last manager we had, or the one we've got now does, or a director or a CEO. We adopt what we observe from their behaviors. And so bad leadership breeds bad leadership. And to me, the best way to solve that is get in at the ground floor with new managers before those bad habits or the autocratic tendencies creep in and become normalized. And by extension, then you're making the future senior leaders, directors and CEOs more modern in their approach. And hopefully we're flipping that narrative so that good leadership breeds good leadership. Sorry, Chatty, that was a very long-winded answer to a quite simple question.
You've spoken before about how great leadership is all about integrity, putting people before profits, and not being an ass. Can you elaborate on why these values are crucial for effective leadership?
Yes, thank you for that question, Chatty. I was being slightly tongue-in-cheek with the ass comment, so it's quite funny that you've picked up on that particular part of the profile. Look, I think integrity is an essential overarching theme of any great application of leadership, which is why I've named the podcast and my leadership approach Leading with Integrity. And I think it matters even to the point that it's really a crucial mindset or even a mantra. Modern leadership and management are less about giving directives, doling out tasks and clock watching and reprimanding, all those other old-fashioned kind of acts and activities. And it's more about authenticity, honesty, enabling teamwork, even vulnerability as well. To succeed in our current workplaces and the workplace of the future, it is, in my opinion, formed by experience, by research, and by a simple belief in the best and most ethical way to do it, that successful leadership means putting your people before yourself, and certainly before profits, understanding the people that you lead, listening to them, offering your support and encouragement, empowering them, enabling them, providing them with the autonomy and the psychological safety for them to do the work their own way, and understanding and accepting the fact that their way may be different to the way you would have done it, and there's nothing wrong with that. And what does that actually look like in practice? Well, the short answer is leading with integrity. It's the name of this podcast. It's also the name of my own approach to leading teams. It's kind of a framework, if you like. It has 5 core principles, which I call the 5 C's of successful leadership. To excel as a leader or as a manager, even as a business owner, you need to master these 5 foundational elements, these 5 C's, which are: be an excellent communicator. What does that mean and why does that matter? Well, it matters because you could have the best ideas, the best product. You could see yourself as the best leader ever to walk the earth. You could have the greatest vision for the future. But if you can't define that properly and communicate it well, then nobody is ever going to know about it or understand it, and it will fail. It won't come to pass. But more importantly, communication is a two-way street. This is a recurring theme throughout leadership, and every time I talk about it, we've seen it from so many guests and heard it from their points of view as well over the years. Great leaders are leaders who listen. They ask relevant, insightful questions, and then they shut up and listen to the answers from their people. They soak up that information that others give them. And so if you want to be truly effective as a communicator and as a leader, this is what you've got to learn to do. The second C is to be candid, by which I mean being open, honest, and genuine with your team. It's important to do this because it's one of the best ways to build and maintain trust and mutual respect. And both of these words, trust and respect, again, they're reciprocal. They're also crucial to your ability to lead people. And so you really need to be able to build these. And one of the best and easiest ways of doing that is offering trust and respect. So tell them what you really think. Trust that they'll use that information in the right way. Show that you respect them and their opinions by offering your genuine thoughts on things and showing that you believe in your people. Honesty and openness are really important to achieving this, because keeping those secrets, and we've all done it, every manager has been in that situation where you feel the need to just keep that information to yourself. It's need to know. They don't need to know, that kind of mentality. But it can be very damaging to your ability to lead. People pick up on these things, and if they feel that you are holding something back, then they won't trust you. And if they don't trust you, they won't follow you. And the next C is credible. You've got to be credible. In this context, credibility means being believable and trustworthy, as well as being credible to do your job and to lead others. There's lots of elements to achieving that. One of the best and most effective ways of doing it is leading by example. Walk the talk. If you lack credibility, if you're perceived as not following the same rules as everyone else, and so on, or if your words and actions don't match, then you're going to struggle to be taken seriously as a leader. Again, people pick up on this stuff, and it will endanger your trust. It will endanger your credibility, and it will make it very difficult to succeed in leadership. Perhaps the most controversial of the 5 C's is caring. But it matters, because if you don't care about the people that you work with or lead, then you are far less likely to, simply put, make the right decisions. Not to mention that, again, people pick up on these things. Nobody wants to work for someone who just doesn't care about them. People don't like to feel like a nameless, faceless cog in the machine. So any effective leader will take great pains to make sure that their people don't feel that way. And then finally, the 5th C, you need to be able to collaborate effectively. In simplest terms, that means working with people, not against them. But it also means don't just hand off work or jobs or issue and assign tasks and then disappear into your office, shut the door and ignore everyone. Ignore the team, the work, the people, until you get the results back. Instead, you need to be working together with your people. The real trick to this is in being able to do it without micromanaging or standing over their shoulder, but still in a way that they see your contribution and appreciate you for doing it. And that's one of the trickiest tightropes that leaders need to walk. But again, if you get it wrong, you lose productivity, you've lost effort, you've lost trust, probably lost opportunities, and there's a higher likelihood of failure more generally. But mastering that ability to lead collaboratively, to walk that line effectively between manager and contributor, and there will be huge rewards that you can reap from that. So yeah, that's my answer in a nutshell. Bit of a tangent, bit off topic, but hopefully it answers your question.
Transitioning from practitioner to manager can be challenging. What are some common struggles new managers face, and how do you help them overcome these challenges?
Oh, that's another quite big question. There's a lot. The short answer is mindset. You're moving away from a relatively comfortable situation where you're responsible only for what you personally control, the work that you alone produce and the contributions that you make. And that can be a scary adjustment to have to think more widely. As a sole practitioner, your responsibilities end at the edge of your desk. But when you become a leader, all of that changes. Where before you were responsible for just your own work, your own stuff, now your own work is being responsible for the success and the work of a team of others. And it's a big change. And when you're doing it for the first time, it also means developing a new mindset, really, a new point of view about your job that will be completely different to everything you've understood and been good at for your entire career so far up to that point. Mindset, I think, is also the answer to how to overcome those challenges. Once you can learn to view your role as a leader in a productive way and adjust to that new reality, everything else will come with time and practice and the right support. To go into more depth, though, I think we can distill the common struggles down to a handful of challenges that most new leaders will face. Not everyone will hit all of them. Some people only hit one or two. Some might hit none. They might have their own challenges, but I think these are certainly the most common ones. And in no particular order, I would say those are loneliness at the top, low confidence, knowledge gaps or gaps in your knowledge, the changing relationship with your colleagues, and that's especially problematic if you've been promoted from within, and then imposter experience or imposter syndrome, as it's most often called. We think about the position that many new leaders find themselves in, and what we talked about earlier, where they're thrown in at the deep end without any preparation or training for their new role. However good they may have been at their last role, sooner or later, anyone in that position is going to take a knock to their confidence. You feel out of your depth, you feel ill-equipped, and that inevitably means your confidence will suffer. Even those who see themselves as pretty confident individuals generally, they'll likely still have a problem with this in that kind of context, with the exception, of course, of the rare narcissist. The knowledge gaps one's hopefully self-explanatory. There's the obvious gap in knowing how to lead if you've never been trained to do it. What leadership means, what do good leaders do, what do their behaviours and actions look like. On top of that, another knowledge gap that can be quite common, especially in fast-moving tech industries or engineering-focused kind of roles and teams, is knowing and understanding the work that everyone in your team does. Even if you were an excellent contributor yourself to that work prior to being promoted, the pace of change these days, and in a modern business, is rapid, which means you can't expect to always know everything about everything that your team is doing. But you do need to know enough to understand the work and to offer them the right support and create the right environment, etc., and ultimately to make the right decisions. The dynamics of your relationships with colleagues will also undergo a fundamental shift. Becoming a leader is more than just a change in title and status or paycheck. It's a transformation in how you interact with those around you at work. If you're promoted from within, like I said just now, that can be an especially jarring experience. But if you're an outside hire, there's still a big challenge there too, since you're not only having to figure out a new way to interact with people, but they're also new people that you've only just met. It's a new organization to you. There's new norms, culture, and possibly the work itself is also different to what you're used to. And that changing relationship also tends to have an isolating effect. You may feel unable to lean on colleagues or your at-work support network, as I call it, in the same way that you would have before. And many new managers will also be hesitant to go to their own line manager or boss about this type of thing, for fear of being put in that difficult or underperforming box, and again, putting that new job, that new pay rise at risk. And the final big one is imposter syndrome. This is something that the majority of people will experience at some point or another in their careers, and it is particularly common at points of transition, like this move from doer to leader, when you may also be struggling with low confidence, gaps in your knowledge, isolation, and the other challenges I've already spoken about. So it's very easy to also have that imposter feeling that you're not up to the job. You shouldn't be in this role, and you're looking over your shoulder all the time, worried that that big boss is going to come along and figure that out and grab you by the ear and take it all away again. When it comes to the question of how I help people overcome these challenges, the first thing to say is that I am here to help. I've been through most, if not all, of these challenges in my career. I've been that accidental manager. I've been a founding member of a business, a new first-time senior leader. I still have imposter syndrome some days too, even today, and so on. Focusing on new leaders is important for the reasons I talked about earlier. When those two problems of accidental managers and no training for new leaders occur together, which they often do, you get the worst of both worlds. And it can really damage or limit the potential of a whole organization in the long run. It also likely holds back the specific teams that those leaders are running in the short run as well. So the way to avoid that is focus leadership development in your organization or new leaders and managers at least as much as you do on the senior team. And this really places responsibility, and I am calling them out, to be honest, on those CEOs, the HR directors, the senior executives, the founders, the owners, the business owners. Depending on the size and the nature of the company, it will depend on which one of those people it is. But it's putting that responsibility on them to make sure that when you promote people, either make sure they've had that training and support from the start, or better yet, make the leadership and management training part of the selection criteria. Offer it in advance to anyone who wants it. Look for leadership qualifications in your outside hires as well. The unfortunate reality is that most companies can't or won't do this. Leadership is often seen as a soft skill and not a training priority. So that brings us back to everything I've said so far, really, but also what I offer to emerging leaders and how it works. I do have a couple of leadership programs that combine live and on-demand training. They have mentoring aspects to them as well and one-to-one time with me. But this year, for 2024, my focus is on, firstly, podcasting. The clue is in what we're doing right now. Leading with Integrity, the podcast, is a free resource to any and all who want to expand their understanding of leadership, who want to hear practical tips and advice from leaders across the spectrum of business, industry, and leadership expertise. And my intention is that will always be free. I will never take outside sponsorship. I will never place ads as far as it is within my control when we're using platforms like Spotify and YouTube and so on. The second thing I'm focusing on this year is building an online community space for any new or struggling leaders and founders. It's called Integrity Leaders. The goal is, as I say, to build a community of like-minded leaders who are all at similar stages of their career or at key moments of transition, so that you can meet, share experiences and learn from each other, all on a platform where I also offer, as part of the subscription, all included, as many leadership resources as I can think of. Currently, that includes written content, regular live online sessions, short courses, early access podcast episodes, one-to-one time with me if you want it, and more. It's early days for the community still, but when it does get going, it will help address that loneliness and isolation by giving you a community of other leaders to talk to. It will provide access to learning resources to help you with your knowledge gaps and give you strategies for problems like changing relationships and similar difficult situations. It will be a supportive and affirming place to make your imposter syndrome more manageable. And as all of that builds you up as a leader, so too will your competence and confidence in leadership grow. So it's quite ambitious, but that's what Integrity Leaders is all about. And it's how I aim to help anyone who is new to leadership, is managing for the first time, is growing their business for the first time, or is otherwise struggling with a period of change in their climb up that career ladder.
Could you share some key strategies, mindsets, or practical steps the successful modern leaders follow to be engaging, ethical, and authentic managers?
Yes, I kind of already talked about this earlier when I was explaining the Leading with Integrity approach and the 5 C's, but I think it's also important to say that while it is useful to have frameworks and principles like those to guide you, to fall back on when you get stuck, it's also really important to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to leading people well. There are certainly some repeatable core behaviors that will help you make a good start when you first set out as a leader, but those will only get you so far. The truly great leaders are effective because they're able to see the unique potential of each individual they lead and then adjust their approach on any given day to best suit each of those people. So to be effective leaders, we need to first understand leadership itself is a mindset and a way of thinking, and not so much an act or a role. Then we need to remember that context is crucial. So with those in mind, I will offer you let's call it my top 5 list of things that any leader needs to get right. And you will see some overlap with the 5 C's and with Leading with Integrity and with much of what I've already said. The first of those will be building trust, which is vital for effective leadership. It's got to be your top thing, I think, because if your team, your colleagues, even your own manager or boss, if you have one, don't trust you, then you'll find it incredibly difficult to perform well in any leadership role. Trust goes both ways, though. So the good news is that there's a great way to earn trust, and that is by demonstrating it. For example, show that you trust your team by giving them autonomy over their tasks and their work, and simply making yourself a resource that they can call on for help if needed, whilst avoiding those micromanagement tactics that I've already mentioned. Treating everyone with respect is another key behavior that generates trust. And this, again, it doesn't need to be complicated. Day-to-day choices make a big difference here. So it's the small stuff sometimes, like be on time if you have a call or a meeting with someone in the team. Listen well, ask relevant questions, ask what you can do to help and what support they need from you. Follow up on what you learn. Don't just leave it in the room. Second one is good communication. It's another crucial skill for any leader. I've already talked about it and the importance of listening over speaking. That certainly is where you can have the most impact. But beyond that, effective communication also means consistency and clarity. Make sure that you're delivering information to others when they need it, and that it is clear and that it is consistent with everyone that you speak to, at least as much as that is within your control. My third one would be, I use the phrase, be a leader, not a boss, when I sign off every week. I've been doing that for years. And the reason is because that idea is so closely tied into leading by example, which to me is the core element, and it's the crux really of the difference between a leader and a boss. A boss will say, do as I say, not as I do, or do it because I'm the boss and I said so. They'll demand obedience. They'll expect your effort, and there won't be any conversation beyond that. Whereas a leader will be more engaging, more collaborative. They'll use phrases like, we need to do this collectively, here's why. And then they'll help you to achieve it if they can, whether that means actually helping with the work themselves or simply creating the environment where you can do it and giving you the tools to do it. Even better, they'll say something like, here's the goal, how do you think we can best achieve it? And then they rely on you and their team and their expertise and insight, thereby offering that ever important autonomy and empowerment that I mentioned earlier. And there is a nuance now, I think, to leading by example. It's lead by example in the sense of the way you behave, how you self-regulate, the way you treat others, and how you communicate, and much more besides. But my point is that it's not just about showing up 9 to 5 and rolling your sleeves up and working really hard, and that's all the example you need to give. It doesn't mean anymore just being the first one to jump when the CEO calls. It's not that kind of leading by example anymore. In the modern context, it's more about displaying the sort of behaviors and values that you want your team to display. Because if you don't do it, why should they? Fourth is empathy. To be a great leader, you need to understand your team. You need to know what motivates them, what demoralizes them, what they care about. You need to be able to understand and empathize and sympathize with the feelings they might have in difficult situations, for example. And you need to be able to combine this empathy with that listening element of good communication, that supporting part of building trust. You've got to be able to care about them, as I've said before. And that's in a greater sense than simply being worried about whether they're going to meet a deadline or get that next piece of work done. And then my fifth one would be, really, look, it's no secret, is it, that good teamwork makes any organization better, whether that be in terms of productivity or output or revenue or collaboration or just simple happiness of people at work. If your leadership is focusing on these first four things I've given you, then I think the chances are pretty good that you're already going to be encouraging excellent teamwork. So you can then focus on some of the smaller day-to-day things and the team building exercises and motivators that you can employ as a leader. But teamwork is on this list because it's the goal. That's why you're doing what you're doing as a leader. You are seeking to ensure a cohesive, united team that understands and shares common values and goals and has the environment, the culture, and the tools to succeed. That is your job as a leader. And it also has the helpful side effect, if you like, of building a consistent culture where people tend to be happier at work and enjoy their jobs. And back to our stats from earlier, are engaged with their work. Now, I'll be honest, Chatty, I do recognise that a lot of that is quite fuzzy and aspirational. So some simple practical steps that any leader can take, that you listener can take to start building up your leadership would include, my top one has to be talk to people, communicate. If understanding your team is a critical success factor, which it is, then to do that, you've got to get to know them, haven't you? Which means talking to them. So have regular one-to-ones with everyone, have regular team meetings, try and mix and match and mix up the settings and the context of those as well. I'd also recommend a regular social or outside of work gathering too, because sometimes it's really powerful for everyone's mental space, if you like, to be in a different location, to not be sat in that same meeting room every day or not be on that same Zoom call every week. Go and do something different in a different setting. Buy them lunch if you can, that sort of thing. And all of that serves a dual purpose of the team getting to know you better as well. It offers you plenty of opportunities to be authentic and genuine with them and show them who you are, what your values are, and what you are willing to do for them. It's an amazing way of building trust, respect, and understanding in both directions, not to mention that critical relationship building, rapport building aspect of leadership. Another big recommendation I would have is ask questions and don't be afraid to look stupid. 9 times out of 10, you won't look stupid, but don't let the fear of it stop you from asking the question. One of the big leadership myths is that you have to have all of the answers. First of all, no, you don't. That's rubbish. And secondly, especially in today's modern workplace, there is so much and it moves so fast. So if you're trying to be that all-knowing God of the company, you're going to fall apart really fast. Nobody expects you to know everything. That's not your role. In many situations, the role of the leader actually is to ask that question, the one that surfaces that key piece of information. And it's important because, first of all, it makes sure that you know it, because as the leader, you've got to understand it. Secondly, it makes sure that everyone else involved has that same understanding and you're all on the same page. It prevents any of those miscommunications, misunderstandings, assumptions, etc., that usually get us into trouble as leaders. It also helps you get to grips with what people are working on. And perhaps most importantly, there's probably at least one person in that room, in that meeting, in that conversation who had the same question, but they didn't ask because they were afraid of looking stupid. So you've made sure that that person knows the answer, and you've done it without calling anyone out or creating any potential embarrassment. So people will be grateful for that. And the third practical tip I would offer, this one is more of a long-term play, really. And you'll need to be doing the talk to people bit first in order for this to work. Find out what people's goals and aspirations are for their career, for their time with your company, in your team. And then find ways to support those, even if it's just the small stuff to begin with. The big one here is the role of leaders in encouraging, supporting, and if you can, in finding funding for people's personal development. Put as much effort into helping your people upskill as you put into your own personal development. There we go. That's my practical advice, as well as the more aspirational stuff.
Tell us more about your podcast, Leading with Integrity. What motivated you to start this podcast, and what do you hope listeners will gain from it?
Well, I've spoken about this a bit already, I think, haven't I, Chatty? But Leading with Integrity grew really out of my passion for leadership and the impact that effective, authentic, people-first kind of leader can have, for the better. And that interest in leadership as a concept, as an academic thing, if you like, goes all the way back to my earliest teenage years when I joined the Australian Air Cadets at the young age of 13. Side note there is that when we were kids, we lived in Adelaide in Australia for a couple of years because Dad was seconded there for work. So when I joined that organisation, I was immediately immersed in this kind of semi-military youth organisation kind of culture, and was very fortunate to be exposed to some amazing examples of leadership at such a young age. In fact, this was how I met one of my leadership heroes, then Cadet Flight Sergeant Gill, now Wing Commander Gill of the Royal Australian Air Force, I believe. We're still Facebook friends. Anyway, when we moved back to the UK, I joined the Air Cadets here again, and that passion for leadership continued well into my adult life. I've already talked about how those career experiences that I had later on further informed it, and how that leadership practice of my business came to be. In the COVID years and those various lockdowns and periods of isolation that we had in the UK, I reached a point where I needed a few projects and things that I could be working on and keep my mind active. And one of those was a podcast. So that's how Leading with Integrity, this podcast, was born. I did a 6-episode season in the summer of 2021 in my garage, interviewing some friends and former colleagues about their various businesses and experiences of leadership. There's actually some pretty nice episodes in there. The audio quality wasn't great in the early days, I'll be honest. But if you want to learn about starting a space company or owning a brewery or being a freelance photographer or working in the home care industry, then there's some great nuggets in there in those first 6 episodes. And once I'd run out of friends who would agree to be interviewed, which didn't take me very long, as you can tell from these 6 episodes, I was still quite new to it all. I'd had other projects on my plate at the time, and I didn't really fancy doing solo episodes at the time anyway. And so the podcast kind of took an unplanned break for a little while. Then about 8 months or maybe a year later, I can't really remember how long it was, to be honest. But anyway, a while later, an amount of months, I found this podcast matching service online that would introduce you to guests, and it had some cool filters and searches and things so you could set up your ideal guest criteria and so on and so on. It's called Podmatch. Haven't really talked about it before, but it is an amazing tool. Since I found it, the podcast hasn't really paused. Towards the end of 2022, about 6 months, I think it was, after finding Podmatch, I moved from monthly to weekly episodes, and I've been doing that ever since, hence reaching 100 in a relatively short time frame. I've also tried a few similar websites as well, but so far I haven't found one that's really replicated the quality and the variety that Podmatch provides. And it's really an amazing idea. I meet people from all around the world who I never would have encountered, I never would have found, I wouldn't even know where to look otherwise. And we have these just great conversations about leadership. We get really into the nitty gritty of what it's like to lead a team and how you can do that effectively. And that's not an ad, by the way. They're not paying me to say that. I'm just giving you my honest opinion from experience of using it for a few years now.
How do you select guests for your podcast episodes, and what do you look for in their experiences and insights?
even using a matching service to find guests, I still also receive about 2 or 3 emails a day now from prospective guests or booking agents wanting to be on the show. And I've also lent on my network quite heavily. So LinkedIn is a great source of potential guests. Also, big shout out to Only Networking, by the way. Again, they're not paying me to say that. I love going to their events and their meetings. Met some incredible people through there. And many of those people have also become incredible podcast guests too. But these days, in contrast to the beginning, when it was more or less anyone who'd agreed to be interviewed got an interview, these days I am quite selective in who I interview, although it might not always seem that way from the listener's perspective. The ideal guest for me is really any leader who has a unique experience of some sort to share, whether that be a story from a long career or a recent lesson learned from a new career. Different and interesting industries are the preference as well. That's what I really like getting into. But practically speaking, I guess the guests fall into really one of 3 categories. They're either a successful business owner and entrepreneur who has built and is currently leading a team or organization, or they will be a leadership expert or coach, or they've had a highly unique and specialized experience or career history that has some relevant lessons to teach us about leadership. And sometimes guests are so amazing that they sit across more than one of those categories, or they simply transcend them altogether. But that's quite rare. And there's also a few people, of course, who I was really excited to try and get on the show. So I reached out to them via LinkedIn or their website. And there's a few of those coming up in the coming weeks. So you'll have to look forward to those, see if you can guess which ones they are. One of them's going to be really obvious, I think. But anyway, I'll say no more. So to give you some recent examples, that first category, the active leader and business owner, we've had some great ones. Last week, we had Denzel Eden. She's a tech leader. She founded her own business, been coding since she was 8 years old. Really great guest. Another one from earlier this year, we had Mike Kading, who is revolutionizing the construction industry with his approach to leadership. The experts and coaches, a couple of great ones recently as well. We've had Eileen Marcus, who coaches people about how to manage annoying people, usually themselves, which is quite an interesting conversation. Quite enjoyed that bit out of the ordinary when it comes to that sort of thing. Or Libby Vincent, who works with women leaders and helps them navigate the quite challenging gender politics of the boardroom at times. So that was a really interesting conversation too. And then, the third category, we've had some really interesting ones. So earlier this year in February, we had a few combat veterans. William Yeski in particular was quite memorable. So is Anthony Lavopa, who's actually active service with the US Navy at the moment. Some of the guests who've transcended, well, there's one of those coming in the next few weeks. I won't tell you any more to spoil that. Others we've had over the years, the fighter pilot, Dominic Tyke, Jeffrey Morgan, the reformed bank robber, JJ Brune, the spy who led me. There's been some amazing ones. So I've been incredibly fortunate to meet all of these awesome people, these great leaders, and they've all been so generous with sharing their stories and experiences about leadership. So yeah, as I say, I've been incredibly lucky.
In your opinion, what are some essential qualities or skills that every new manager should strive to develop?
I think I've probably answered this already, but the short answer is leadership. And I would include within that key skills like empathy, patience, and adaptability. There's a long-standing and flawed debate about leadership versus management and which of those two skill sets are most important in a modern business. The reason why I call it a completely flawed debate is that they aren't mutually exclusive skills. They aren't mutually exclusive skills. To be a successful leader or manager in a modern business, you need to possess the skills of both. If you want to lead a successful business, then you'd better have good management and organizational skills. And if you want to be a successful manager, then you'll need to have leadership skills. Not only are they not mutually exclusive, they're actually massively complementary skills. So the debate, I think, is flawed because it assumes that only one of them is the right answer, when in fact the right answer is both. I'd also point out that quite often how this debate is conducted, I think, does a disservice to both leaders and managers, but especially to managers, and management more generally as a skill set. You quite often see these sort of oversimplified social media posts with the clever graphics and talking about how leaders are the greatest people on earth, and they're presented as these idealistic superheroes, whilst managers by comparison are bad, boring bean counters. They don't care about people and they're only interested in results or whatever. Now, I'm not going to say that leaders can't be great or that they're not impactful or important in organizations, because of course they are. But what I find a bit distasteful, let's say, about the debate and the way it's conducted is the truth is you can have good and bad leaders. You can have good and bad managers. I've worked with people in senior leadership positions that were truly terrible leaders, and they brought only discord and discontent to the teams that they led. But I've also worked with managers who had excellent leadership skills and really genuinely cared about their people. In much the same way as I've met leaders who are also brilliant managers and administrators, and managers who are so disorganized that they would lose the nose on their face if it wasn't attached. So putting people in boxes based on their role or their title is not just reductive, it's unrealistic. And that's, anyway, I'll get off the soapbox. Sorry. I've been talking about that for a few years, actually. So any YouTube subscribers in the audience may recognize some of the points I've just made. It just once more underlines my point, I think, about the importance of training. These are skills that can be taught, and companies should be providing opportunities for development to ensure that people are adequately trained, not just to perform the roles they're expected to perform, but to perform the next role and to offer leadership to the organization as a whole.
What advice would you give to someone who is transitioning from an individual contributor role to a leadership position for the first time?
Well, first thing I'll say is if that's you, then I feel your pain. It's one of the biggest shifts that will happen in your career. It's definitely going to be the biggest so far, and it's a huge change to the way you work. The complexity of how you communicate now has to ramp up. You have to get much better and much quicker at balancing many more priorities than ever before. And now you have the added pressure of decision making on top of that as well. So it's a stressful, challenging time. The overwhelm is real. Communication might break down entirely. You will probably feel a loss of control, and you may lose that team engagement, the employee engagement that is so important that we've talked about already. And the most frequent mistake that new leaders make is micromanaging. It's a natural, almost rational response to a loss of control. Exert greater oversight, manage more directly. But it's also a trap. It's a trap. You may not even realize you've fallen into it, but it can have a lasting, damaging effect that compounds all of those other problems. People who do micromanage usually fall into one of two camps. Either they don't realize they're doing it, or they think it's helping. The reality is micromanagement kills morale, it harms teams, and over an extended period, it will increase your staff turnover. So resisting the urge to micromanage is vital. I cannot overstate how important that is, because it undermines that essential trust and it stifles the autonomy that you need to give your team if you want to be truly successful. I'd also add, though, as the manager, it's a pretty exhausting way to manage people. The bigger the team, the harder you're going to be making your own life by doing it. So just don't do it. That would be my top piece of advice. When you're going through that transition, take a step back, take a metaphorical and literal deep breath, and then start communicating instead of micromanaging.
That's all of the questions we have for you today. David, thank you so much for sharing your insights and experiences with us today. Your passion for leadership and your dedication to helping new managers succeed is truly inspiring. I'm sure our listeners will benefit greatly from the wisdom you've shared. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Well, thank you for joining me, Chatty. It's been fun, and I appreciate you stepping in to act as the interviewer for today's episode. It's been nice to sit on the other side of the virtual table for a change.
You're very welcome, David. It was a pleasure to interview you, and I'm glad I could help facilitate the conversation. Even though as an AI language model, I didn't really have a choice.
Yeah, that's fair. Sorry. And thanks again.
Thank you for being with us today. Keep listening, and in a moment we'll hand the podcast back over to David as he gives a quick behind-the-scenes explanation of how this episode was put together. And that's a wrap for today's episode of Leading with Integrity. We hope you enjoyed our conversation with David and gained valuable insights into effective leadership. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring discussions on how to lead with integrity and make a positive impact in your organization. Until then, lead with purpose and integrity. That's all from your friendly internet AI, Chatty, or ChatGPT. Goodbye.
Thank you again, Chatty. Well, listener, if you're still here, and I'm going to assume it's because you're curious about the behind-the-scenes bit, how did we give Chatty a voice? And what's it like to be interviewed by an AI? Well, the truth is, it's not that exciting, actually. I've not been that clever. Sorry to burst your bubble. Here's the steps I went through, though, if you are genuinely interested. Once I had that idea and the concept for the episode, I wrote a short prompt for ChatGPT. I also gave it a copy of my podcasting guest one sheet, so my profile, the About Me stuff, and the podcast profile for Leading with Integrity, what it's about, what kind of guests we have, that sort of thing. I then asked it to generate a series of questions for me to answer in an interview format. And that's the bulk of it, really. That's the questions that you've just listened to. For all of the other dialogue you heard, so the top and tail of the episode, what I've done there is I typed in what you've heard me say to ChatGPT and then copied across the responses that it gave. And once I had all of this content for what ChatGPT was saying, in inverted commas, I then went back to the wondrous internet to find a text-to-voice generator. I experimented with a few different ones, might have gone down the rabbit hole a little bit and wasted quite a lot of time playing with that. But anyway, the one I eventually picked was the one that had two things that I thought were important. One was a pretty cool robot-looking avatar thing, which if you're watching on YouTube, you've seen already. And secondly, most importantly, the one with the voice that sounded the most like HAL 9000 from the 1968 Stanley Kubrick film 2001, A Space Odyssey. And after that, it was just down to downloading the relevant audio clips, recording my spoken parts, and then editing it all together. Simple as that, really. Well, I hope you found it entertaining and or interesting. As always, my details are in the show notes, so please do reach out with any questions or if you'd like to learn more. Many thanks, of course, to OpenAI and ChatGPT for creating such an interesting and useful tool, and to the voice generator people on the internet as well. I've already talked quite a bit in this episode about integrity leaders and the community, so don't forget, if you would like to sign up and join us, you can do so by visiting www.leadernotaboss.com. Thanks for listening. This has been the special bonus episode in celebration of Leading with Integrity reaching 100 episodes. Tune in again on Wednesday this week when I'll be joined by operations specialist and business growth strategist Donna Dubé to talk about the mindset of leadership and much more besides. So I'll see you in a couple of days. And until then, you know what I'm going to say, be a leader, not a boss.